Julia and Brandon's story was full of excitement when Julia first arrived in the US. From the moment they met on a dating app, their connection was undeniable. But it was clear from the beginning that there were going to be obstacles. One of the first major challenges in their relationship was Julia's adjustment to life on Brandon's family farm in Virginia. While Brandon had always been close to his parents, particularly his mother Betty, Julia quickly found herself in an uncomfortable position. Julia, fresh from Russia and eager to start a new life, had dreamed of living independently with Brandon. However, the reality was much different. Betty, who ran the family farm, expected Julia to adapt to the family's ways, particularly in terms of farm responsibilities, and it didn't take long for Julia to feel like she was living in Betty's shadow. Brandon, caught between his love for Julia and his loyalty to his mother, failed to understand how overwhelming Betty's presence could be for Julia. Cultural differences at the heart of the tension between Julia and Betty was a clash of cultures. Growing up in Russia, Julia was accustomed to a certain level of independence and personal space, something she hoped to maintain in her new life with Brandon. However, Betty had a much different idea of how things should go. As a traditional mother figure, Betty expected Julia to take on a more domestic role, running the household and contributing to the family farm. For Betty, this wasn't just about work. It was about Julia becoming part of the family, as she had done with her other children's partners. Julia's desire to pursue a career, including modeling, and have her own space to grow was in direct conflict with Betty's vision of what a wife should be. Betty, in her mind, was offering advice and trying to help Julia adjust, but Julia saw it as stifling and controlling. The first real argument came when Julia expressed her frustration with how often Betty interfered in their private lives. Betty didn't understand why Julia was so upset, while Julia felt increasingly suffocated by Betty's attempts to run her life. Early signs of tension in the first few weeks of Julia's arrival. The tension between Julia and Betty was subtle but undeniable. Julia wanted to settle into her relationship with Brandon without constant reminders of Betty's presence. However, Betty, trying to show affection, went overboard, trying to cook for Julia, giving unsolicited advice, and constantly finding reasons to be around. What started as small annoyances, Betty asking Julia to help with farm work or giving parenting tips, soon escalated into full-blown confrontations. The worst part for Julia was that Brandon seemed to dismiss her concerns, saying things like, "Mom is just trying to help," or "She doesn't mean to overstep." Building frustration and struggles for independence. Betty's expectations of Betty had certain expectations for Julia, which were rooted in her own traditional views about marriage and family. She saw Julia as a young woman who was still adjusting to life in the US and felt that it was her duty to ensure that Julia adapted to the family's farm life. Betty would often suggest that Julia quit pursuing modeling, offering advice on how she could be a better housewife, and taking on responsibilities like cooking, cleaning, and helping out on the farm. For Betty, these weren't just tasks. They were roles that came with being a wife and mother. But Julia had her own dreams, ones that didn't include running a farm. She wanted to have a life in America where she could pursue her passions. While she respected Betty as Brandon's mother, Julia began to feel resentful. She hadn't come to America just to become part of Betty's world. She wanted to create her own path with Brandon, away from the constant supervision of his family. Julia's desire for independence. Julia's frustration grew as she realized that Betty didn't understand her desire for independence. Back in Russia, Julia had been an independent woman, taking care of herself, making her own decisions, and having the freedom to explore different career opportunities. She didn't want to give all that up just to fit into a life on a farm. Julia dreamed of pursuing a career in modeling and hoped to use her time in America to grow professionally. She wanted to take control of her life, but every time she tried, Betty was there, trying to redirect her into a more traditional role. This led to numerous arguments between Julia and Betty, where Julia expressed her anger at being treated like a child who needed constant guidance. She felt Betty was undermining her autonomy, and this caused Julia to feel trapped. She wanted to make her own decisions about her life, her career, and her future with Brandon. But Betty's constant presence made that impossible. Chronic misunderstandings and growing tension. Brandon, caught in the middle of his love for Julia and his loyalty to Betty, failed to see the gravity of the situation. While he wanted to please Julia, he was also trying to keep the peace with his mother. Julia's growing frustration led to more emotional outbursts, but Betty just couldn't seem to understand. Whenever Julia voiced her feelings, Betty would counter that she was just trying to help and that Julia should be grateful for the support. This only made Julia feel more isolated, as she was increasingly alienated from both Brandon and Betty. The breaking point. The climactic argument. The turning point in Julia and Betty's relationship came during a particularly heated argument. Julia, feeling completely overwhelmed by Betty's constant presence in her life, finally reached her breaking point. It started when Betty asked Julia to help with yet another farm chore, and Julia snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. "You're treating me like a child. I didn't come here to be your servant. I came here to be with Brandon, to start a life with him, not to live under your control," Julia shouted. This was the moment when Julia finally aired all her frustrations, and it was loud, messy, and raw. Betty, taken aback by Julia's outburst, didn't know how to react. She had always prided herself on being a loving, caring mother, but she didn't understand how she had crossed the line. Betty tried to defend herself, explaining that she was just looking out for Julia, but this only made Julia feel more dismissed. It was clear now that their relationship was in serious trouble. Julia's desire to leave, after the argument, Julia began to seriously consider leaving. She couldn't stay on the farm any longer if things continued like this. She wasn't just upset with Betty, she was also hurt by Brandon's failure to take her side. Despite her feelings, Julia didn't want to walk away from Brandon, but she needed to feel like an equal partner, not just someone who had to accept everything Brandon and Betty wanted for her. She told Brandon, "I can't do this anymore. Either we leave and start our own life, or I go back to Russia." This was an ultimatum that Brandon couldn't ignore. Julia's frustration and unhappiness were no longer just about Betty's interference. They were about her sense of self-worth and independence. For Julia, the idea of staying in a life where she felt constantly controlled was unbearable. Betty's response and justification. Betty, meanwhile, was still trying to come to terms with what had happened. She felt hurt by Julia's accusations and couldn't understand why Julia didn't appreciate her help. Betty had always been the glue holding the family together, and now her relationship with her son's fiancé was hanging by a thread. She didn't know how to fix things, but she felt like her intentions had always been in the right place. She had only wanted to ensure that Julia felt welcome and part of the family. The aftermath and reflection. Julia's time away. Julia decided to leave, taking some time to think about her next steps. She needed space to breathe, away from the tension that had been building up for months. During this time, Julia reflected on her dreams, her relationship with Brandon, and the future she wanted to build for herself. She realized that she couldn't continue living under Betty's shadow, no matter how much she loved Brandon. She also realized that she had sacrificed too much of her own identity in trying to fit into a mold that wasn't right for her. Betty's regret and reflection. In the weeks following the argument, Betty began to reflect on her actions. She realized that she had overstepped in many ways, and while her intentions had been to help, she had alienated Julia in the process. Betty for the first time considered that Julia wasn't the problem. Her own actions might have been the cause of the tension. Betty began to regret not listening to Julia earlier and was unsure how to repair the damage. Moving forward, can Julia and Betty find common ground? Reconciliation. Attempts after some time apart, both Julia and Betty began to soften. Betty reached out to Julia to apologize, acknowledging that she had been too controlling. Julia, in turn, expressed that she understood that Betty was just trying to help, but needed her own space to figure things out. Their conversations, though difficult, were a step toward understanding each other. Brandon's role in repairing the relationship. Brandon, having seen how much pain this had caused both Julia and Betty, finally took a more active role in mediating between the two women. He began to assert himself more, standing up for Julia while also trying to explain Betty's actions. Slowly, the family dynamics started to shift. Brandon learned that in order to keep his relationship with Julia intact, he had to set boundaries with his mother. Final thoughts and the future. Julia and Betty's relationship was far from perfect, but it was improving. They learned to navigate their differences and come to a mutual understanding. Julia and Brandon, now more united than ever, started to plan their future together, focusing on building a life that was truly their own. Conclusion. The relationship between Julia and Betty was one of the most complicated dynamics on 90 Day Fiancé, Happily Ever After. But it also offered an important lesson in the power of communication, boundaries, and personal growth. Despite their differences, Julia and Betty proved that, with time and effort, even the most strained relationships can improve. Their journey was a reminder that family dynamics are never easy, but with patience and understanding, healing is always possible.